Hi, welcome everybody. As you are pouring in, go ahead and just pop in the chat. Maybe say who you are, say hello, where you're zooming in from today. And the name of today's webinar is Abolition. Can religion help us imagine a world without policing in prisons? So we're just going to continue to allow people to pour in. Like I said, make yourself at home. Hey, Lucy from Ohio, good to see you. Just pop in the chat, say your name, hello, where you're from. Thanks a lot for being here. And we'll get started in a minute.
That's my daughter. Hi, Sophie.
And also throughout the talk, you're free to put questions into the Q&A. There'll be a tab at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those at the latter half of the panel. And we will spend about 10 minutes doing an introduction. We'll have a discussion for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A time for the remaining 20 minutes. So you will hopefully have time to have your question answered. And also, if you're here with us and you're not already a member of DSA, I encourage you to do that if you want to put some boots on the ground with some like-minded communities of folks. Highly recommend, and I hope you're enjoying the rest of the conference. Also, after this panel, there is a session at 3:30 and another session at 5 o'clock. I encourage you to check those out too. At 3:30, there's a group on intergroup organizing, and that's where we'll go into breakout rooms based on different faith traditions. So whether you're Christian, Jewish, etc., hopefully we'll have a group that you can connect with there. Also at 3:30, there's a how to organize one-on-one, and you'll get some training from an experienced organizer on how to have one-on-one conversations with people. Incredibly useful for this type of work. And at 5 o'clock, there will be a workshop on how to start a local religion and socialism group where you are, if you live in an area where there's one already. And again, if you're just now joining us, go ahead and put your name in the chat, say hello, and where you're zooming in from today. And we will go ahead and get started. Like I said, the title of this is Abolition. Can religion help us imagine a world without policing in prisons? My name is Stephen Crouch. I'm a member of the New York City Religion and Socialism Working Group. And today I'm joined by Reverend Anthony Jermaine Ras Alam, Rabbi Bera Elman, and organizer Nurda Ahmed. And we will go ahead and get started. And remember, you can pop your questions in the Q&A throughout this, and we'll get to them at the end. So to start off, we'll go around, and I'll just have the panelists introduce themselves. Jermaine, would you like to go first?
Sure, why not? Thanks again, Stephen, for the opportunity to talk with everyone here and to meet everyone. It's great. I'll just start off by saying my name is Anthony Jermaine Ras Alam, but most people call me Jermaine. I'm an ordained minister with the PCUSA. I was ordained in the Twin Cities in Minnesota in 2012, but I'm originally from a small town in Southeast Texas called Willis, Texas, which is a one-exit town that's getting bigger and bigger. Right now, I'm a PhD student at Union Theological Seminary. I'm working on my dissertation. The working title of my dissertation is Toward a Social Ecology of Extralegal Violence Against Afro-Americans After Slavery. And let's see, I'm also not quite a member, but a visiting very close associate at Rendell Memorial Presbyterian Church, where I am happy to teach Sunday school to adults every Sunday at the invitation of Reverend Dr. Flora. Oh my goodness, I almost forgot my pastor's name. Flora Wilson Bridges. That's me. And should I pass it off now?
Yeah, go ahead and pass it off.
I'll pass it on to organizer Nura.
Peace, everybody. Salams. My mom's calling me. Give me a minute. Oh, this is, never mind. My name is Noura Ahmed. I am an organizer, I'm a writer, I am a creative based in Seattle, Washington. Graduated from the University of Washington back in 2020 and missed an uprising and a pandemic. Oh my God, it's crazy. But graduated with a political science and international relations degree. But as soon as I graduated, I jumped right into organizing. When I heard about George Floyd, I knew I just couldn't just sit by and watch it happen. And there was already some sort of effort towards abolition in Seattle, and I really wanted to join. Like, there was this like sense of like, I had a sense of like what was going on and what was the problem. But as soon as that happened, everything started to click for me. But I was also part of political organizing in Seattle, and right now I'm a communication associate at this organization that works on youth homelessness, and I am also doing abolitionist work as well. And recently started a collective around, co-founded a collective around bringing that Muslim perspective to abolition and making sure that Muslims were a part of this fight and this movement as much as possible. And I know there's hella organizations all over the country around doing that work, but I wanted to make sure that in Seattle, it's such a big issue that I wanted to make sure that Muslims were also part of that too. But yeah, that's me too. That's me. And I'll pass it to Rabbi Barrett Arman, if that's how you.
Barrett, yeah. So Ramadan Mubarak to you first, Nora, and also, yeah. So I'm here in Brooklyn on unceded Lenape land, and I'm a professor of religion and theology at Fordham University as an adjunct professor, I should say, which puts me in the class of the downtrodden employees. But I've also been teaching for a number of years with Bard College's prison program, the Bard Prison Initiative in correctional facilities in New York State. I think I've always was raised as a leftist, I've always been a leftist, but kind of an armchair leftist for a great part of my life. And as Nora was saying, that for her, George Floyd kind of got her animated. For me, it was Eric Garner and Mike Brown, those two murders in quick succession with no accountability, really just kind of didn't shock me. They shocked me and they didn't shock me. I mean, I kind of knew, but I hadn't really thought or realized or really, like many white people, it was not a lived experience for me. And so I didn't really think about it as an actual experience. It was much more abstract. So since then I've become really very concerned around police accountability and anti-racism work around policing, also criminal injustice system reform. I call it that increasingly because it's what we have is not a justice system. And as I've gotten increasingly involved, I've moved increasingly to the abolitionist stance on both issues of policing and prisons. I've done a lot of reading and studying about both alternatives to policing and to prisons, and as well as analyses of the origins of both and their deep rootedness in racist systems that, to me, suggest very firmly that they are not really redeemable. And so that's become where I have come. It's become kind of a passion of mine, really kind of taken over my life in a way that I never really expected it to. I was ordained as a rabbi. I thought I'd be a pulpit rabbi. I didn't really think I'd be going into I didn't think my rabbinate would be in such a political realm, but it has become very much, that's where I act as a rabbi primarily, is in advocacy and in the streets, trying to address the issues of racism, particularly in the forms of anti-Black racism and anti-immigrant, refugee, undocumented people racism.
Thank you all for those wonderful introductions, and thank you for your time and being here today. Now, when we first started organizing this panel, I should say a lot of things have happened since we first put this panel together. So in the past week or two, we've had the George Floyd verdict. We've had the murder of Ma'Khia Bryant in Columbus, Ohio. And we've had footage released of Adam Toledo and his murder. In light of all of this together, what does this mean for abolitionist work? And any of you can answer this.
Well, I want to just, before I don't need to answer it first, but I just want to add the name of Andrew Brown, who was, we don't have footage yet of what happened. They're trying to get the tapes released, but he was shot by North Carolina and Elizabeth, North Carolina police, fatally shot. And that's another post George Floyd trial police murder. And I believe I read just today, although I can't find that article this minute, there have been 6 police shootings, fatal police shootings since the verdict came down. So you might have to say your question again because I don't remember anymore.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Rabbi Barrett. So in light of 6 murders ever since the George Floyd verdict, what does this mean for abolitionist work?
Anyone else want to go first?
It means that Chauvin's case didn't really change anything. I'm not gonna lie, like I was really frustrated when I heard about Chauvin's case. People were calling George Floyd a murder. They were like, yeah, he died for the movement. People were like saying all types of things. Like I remember Nancy Pelosi being like, thank you, George Floyd, for dying for this justice to be served. And I'm like, no, that's really effed up, first off. Because he didn't die. He didn't just, he wasn't a martyr. He got murdered, you know? And at the same time, if justice was really served, he would have been here. He would have been alive. His daughter would have had a father now, you know? And that's the reality. Like, I believe that the 6 murders that have happened since the Chauvin's verdict, it means that there's already more of a sentiment with police officers that they're going to lash out at black folks. They're going to do a lot of stuff because they believe that, you know, like someone said one time, the system has to sacrifice a few to keep intact, right? It has to make sure to, you know, make sure that it does this and this so that the whole system won't be just retributed or abolished altogether. And I think what caused Chauvin's case to be so important when other cases have not, and like Eric Garner, Philando Castile, all these people who have killed young black folks and black folks in general and have murdered them in cold blood. The fact that those people didn't get weren't seen as guilty, but Derek Chauvin was because there was months and months and months and months of organizing that have happened all over the country. People have risked their lives on the streets. People have been arrested. People have been killed. There is this national pressure, right, all over the country to defund the police and to abolish the police altogether, right? And that is what caused that pressure to mount up to George Floyd's case, and why it's so important to understand that, because it's not justice, it's accountability. And people don't understand that, but people don't understand that because they think that, wow, like the system puts on this facade of being, oh, we found justice, but there is no justice in a system that is rotten. There's no justice in that at all. But and I believe that if the system in of itself, and it's like a tree, you know, there's no few bad apples. It's because the tree is rotten, you know. So why not take out down the whole tree? Why not do all of that stuff and build a tree or plant a tree that like goes towards community care, community healing, and community health, right? Making sure that the money that is allocated towards these police departments are allocated towards this. The Chauvin case is an indicator that there's gonna be some type of backlash against Black folks. And we saw the day of the Chauvin's case, Ma'Khia Bryant got murdered in Cleveland, Ohio. So that is one thing that is important to understand as well.
I want to pick up on that. I think you said, you mentioned accountability and justice. I think the third thing is just to also recognize that it wasn't the justice system that worked in the case of Derek Chauvin. It was the video that worked in the case of Derek Chauvin. If we had not seen that murder taking place on camera for a protracted period of time, where it was so clear, even more than Eric Gardner's case, where there's a little bit of scuffling and you can't quite, you could potentially people could see it in different ways. It was so explicitly clear what happened. And that was why this particular man was brought to trial. And if that video had not happened, there is no question he would not have been. In fact, the first reports about the death implied that he was killed, that he died at the police station, that something happened en route. So already there was disinformation before the video came out and showed what actually happened. But the other thing I think that for me feels really important about this case is the danger of among people of seeing it as evidence that the justice system works. Here was a bad cop, he murdered, people stood up in his own, precinct and his other colleagues, and they said, you're bad, we don't do that. You violated our honor by doing this, we reject you, and he was convicted. And it's going to be very tempting for people to say, see, that worked. That blue wall of silence, it can be cracked when there's something really egregious like this. And so we don't need to worry. But in fact, he's not a rogue cop. We know, in New York City where I am, there are so many cases of police killing Black people, you cannot keep up. And so it's not a rogue phenomenon. The videotaping is perhaps the rogue thing, and thank God for it. But so it's not just accountability. It's let's keep recognizing that policing cannot police itself, and it will never police itself. And so if we're relying on that as a way to ensure that that it is a system that can work, that is actually can be what it claims to be, a system designed for our collective safety, then it has to. The way it functions with its own self-correcting systems which do not work, it's not possible to do that.
I would absolutely and 100% affirm what both my co-panelists have said so far, and maybe build upon it just a little bit to say that I feel like one of the many challenges that we face as religious people is, I think, to make sure that we find a way to continue to distinguish our perception of what is happening from the civil religion narrative that's been bookended for us. And when I think of these bookends, I'm thinking of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi in their kente cloth kneeling some months ago. Perhaps bookended on the other end, as Nura just said, with Nancy Pelosi lifting up her hands and looking up to the sky and saying, thank you to George Floyd for giving your life, I believe she had the audacity to say. And so I think we have to have the ability to notice a counterfeit for our traditions when we see it. It's a counterfeit of, the Christian gospel and the notion of other forms of sacrifice that themselves have problems. But I think as people who really care about abolishing prisons, we have to extract ourselves to a certain degree from the commercial civil religion narrative that is really impatient and wants to sort of put a nice bow at the end of a certain kind of story that makes people think that we went through some kind of catharsis and have reached some type of ending. And I think if we fail to do that, we'll be, aiding and abetting people who are trying to make people sort of whet their appetites, or rather, make people feel like you should be satisfied now because you've been served justice, when in fact what people are being served is fast food instead of like food for the soul. And I think if we allow our appetites to be ruined on junk food, we do lose our appetites for justice. And we can see simply from the number of people who continue to be killed by the cops, men and women and children, there's no reason for us to see the prosecution and the guilty verdict for one murderer to be somehow the ending of a story or the beginning of a new chapter. But at the same time, we have to try to fight against cynicism or something in us that wants to have only a negative story to keep pressure on, but instead to be able to find other ways to if not celebrate, but to renew our spirits, even as we realize their story about justice and success is not our story, but we have our own, and we are continually making those stories in our communities.
Yeah, on that last point, I just want to add again, I mentioned the video as being kind of the hero in the story. One thing that we can say, we should talk about like highlighting the bright spots, is that I think, thankfully, the capacity to video, for bystanders to video, and for that now to go viral is something to seize upon. That it is, that people seem to be more willing. I don't know how, I mean, I say people, like I have no idea what percentage of people I'm talking about, if this really is in fact a great change, but there are some people willing to bravely record what's happening and share it with us, and that is an instrument that makes it, at least gives us a tool to start to cut into this, which we did not have before. People who were not in communities that were heavily policed did not see what police were doing. We you know, I mean, my community, I live in Park Slope. It's a very, very, you know, well off, mostly white neighborhood, and yeah, policing in my city, my neighborhood, you know, it's not offensive for the most part. It is offensive when I see how police congregate around the high school, which has a lot of people of students of color. But you know, I mean, someone, you have to be sensitive to that to notice it, and many people I don't think even do. They see that their normal lives are not impacted by police, and so having these videos that show us what in real time what is happening, I think is something that we can look on as a phenomenon to be grateful for.
Thank you, Barrett. And Jermaine, you also mentioned prisons, and this panel also not only talks about police, but prisons. So can you, Jermaine, with the historical studies you've been doing on the history of policing and prisons in the United States, can you talk about how, in what ways they're part and parcel of the same system, and how, in what ways does that go further back than, how does that predate policing in general?
My goodness, you know, I wish that I knew more about it, but scholars have, of course, understood for a very long time that our policing system goes hand in hand with, you know, sort of slave catching, if you'll excuse the phrase, and ways of harassing and displacing indigenous people in this land. So it's impossible for us to disconnect the history of policing from what we see it doing today, because we see police functioning basically according to what they're trained to do, except maybe evade the camera lens. And I think the connection with prison, of course, maybe is obvious and maybe is less obvious, but there's a sense in which these prisons for some people are symbols of safety, that there's some place for us to put the bad people, but we don't have to peel back the layers very long to understand that prisons, in addition to other things, were methods by which people tried to recapture the labor of emancipated people, and to keep a storehouse of labor to use against working people, so that there was always this threat of precarious labor to undermine, you know, white workers and other groups of workers, should they not, you know, or should they instead threaten to organize or demand being treated like human beings. And so I think prisons have always been used not only as a torture machine for human beings and a function of terrorism for precarious communities, but it's also been a way to undermine solidarity between workers. And not only that, but also as means to disrupt flows of intergenerational wealth and to prevent communities from producing the kinds of leadership that could contribute to breaking the status quo. And so there's a whole lot more research out there than I've read, and I think a whole lot more to be done so that we see the continuity between prisons and various forms of policing, so that we're not caught by surprise and think that, you know, Derek Chauvin and others are anomalies, but instead to see this is just the tip of the iceberg that's captured by cameras in the right place in the right time, but instead patterns, you know, that have been going on in this country as long as I can remember, by various names.
Thanks, Jermaine. And Barrett, I know you yourself have worked a lot in prisons. Can you talk a little bit about how that has shaped your perspective on abolition?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is that working in prisons has given me the incredible opportunity, really the blessing of combating what our system sets up, which is a design to keep people who are incarcerated and people who are not incarcerated as far apart as possible, so that we don't have any, we who are not incarcerated have no contact with or no awareness for, and no awareness of, and no sense of responsibility for people who are incarcerated. And likewise, people who are incarcerated are prevented from having access to the citizenship rights of people who are not incarcerated. And so that's the first thing. I mean, I'm so grateful that I've had the chance to meet so many people who are incarcerated. And then since then, in my work out here outside in the non-incarcerated world, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I mean, you see people. I know wonderful people I've met as my students in state prisons, many of whom have committed horrific crimes. They admit it. They're not saying, I am here, I was not guilty, I was imprisoned for a crime I did not commit. I had no student who said that. Now, and whether there were some that did, I don't know, but none of them said that to me. And some of them admitted that they had, we taught a class on The Stranger, which has a plot about murder. So we talked about murder, and people admitted that they had committed murder. But that, that was an event in their lives, which they acknowledged, but it was not the defining element of their lives. And it certainly was no longer the defining element of their lives. At one point it was, and people grow. And I'm going to say something that I just feel like I need to say, because it's in a way somewhat provocative, but I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of Derek Chauvin. How do I, as an abolitionist, deal with the fact that this guy has been has been convicted and is going to be sentenced for his murder, and go to prison? And I've said to a lot of my friends, his sentencing is not the hill I'm going to die on around prison abolition. But that being said, just like with people who do death penalty, capital punishment advocacy, argue that the thing to work with is the most horrific crime, and show that even in that case, the person does not deserve to be murdered for the action that that person did. I would say in the case of Derek Chauvin, if I really believe that prisons are not good, not productive, they don't serve a cause, they actually cause more harm, then I have to say that for him too. And so I started fantasizing, like, what would I do if I were in the position of being able to sentence this man? And I was thinking, somewhat along the lines of how Maimonides, who was a 12th century brilliant rabbi and legal scholar who lived first in Spain and then in Cairo, talks about these stages of repentance. And one of them is you have to first kind of acknowledge what you've done, truly admit I did this. And then you have to confess what you've done to the people you harmed. You have to provide some kind of restitution to those people. And you have to take responsibility and perhaps suffer some negative outcomes. So what would that mean for someone like him? Maybe it means that for the next 20 years, Derek Chauvin has to spend all of his working life working in ways that remedy what he did on behalf of the Chauvin family, in the precinct itself, to teach his former colleagues, in any kind of capacity he can, with check-ins, perhaps daily, weekly, I don't care, maybe a salary, because I don't think and people who should do, even in prison, should be not able to support themselves, and do this for 20 years. And then at 20 years, we look and say, where are you now? Are you able to function? Can you be a citizen? Have you learned something? As opposed to shutting people off into prison. So I feel like I kind of lost track of where I'm going with that. But I guess my point is that if I'm going to say that no one is their worst crime, I have to apply that even in this case. And it doesn't mean I have sympathy for him, and certainly not at this point. It does not mean that I exonerate him by any means. But I have to believe that everybody is redeemable, and that our prison system doesn't. It claims to. We call it corrections, but it's not. We don't. It's punitive. It's designed to be punitive.
Any other thoughts on that before I move on to the next question? The next thing I wanted to touch on is the slogan of defund the police. And Nerda, I was thinking you might be a good person to answer this, because I know you told me in our conversation that your views have changed a lot throughout your organizing in the past year. And so it's people have tons of different ideas of what defund means. Nerda, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your experience was when you first started organizing, what your thoughts of the slogan was, and how that changed as you started to do more work around that.
When I first started off, defund the police was mostly just a policy initiative, right? I was working alongside like many other coalitions to get the goal was to defund the police by 50%, right? That was the goal. And we didn't. We ended up getting defunded. We ended up defunding the police by like 1%, which is like crumbs, little crumbs. But when I first started off, defunding the police, I was working with a bunch of other Black-led coalitions and organizations that have been massively, what do you call it? Impacted by police, right? And then the idea is to make sure that like that money that is being allocated to the police is being like given to those organizations, because those organizations are the response, the alternatives to policing, to the people that are talking about transformative justice, restorative justice, the people that are talking about reentry for incarcerated, like recently released incarcerated folks, talking about people talking all this stuff, right? People that are doing abolitionist work, so, and orgs that are doing this work and making sure that the need to help like incarcerated folks, as well as like recently incarcerated folks, recently freed incarcerated folks, and just talking about alternatives to policing, how that has changed, especially in the past like several months, is wild to me. You know, I think a big part of it is making sure that the community understands the idea of defund the police. I've had Black people come up to me, community members come up to me talking about, I actually don't really support defund the police. I don't know why. And I'm like, and then I talk about it with them, right? And it's I think a big part of it is a lot of their own political education around defunding the police as well. And understanding that, you know, it's a policy issue, but it is also a systemic issue. It is a problem that many people don't understand. It's a problem that affects many people, right? At the same time, there are so many cities all over the country that invest so much of their budgets into the police, right? In Seattle, the city invests like literally millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into Seattle Police Department. And that is one of the biggest issues that we had a problem with, because homelessness was on its high. People didn't have adequate health care. People couldn't get food. Like it got to the point where nobody knew where to get their next meal, right? It got to the point where healthcare was an issue, where people were being traumatized, being killed on the streets every single day, right? And I think a big part of like defunding the police is also making sure that money that is being allocated towards police is being allocated to community organizations and community-based organizations that are doing that work and addressing those needs. Homelessness, lack of healthcare, lack of like food deserts, you know, gun violence prevention programs, all of this stuff, right, is what defunding the police is really all about. And people think it's because we're taking money away from like away from police, and so suddenly the police will just go away. Understanding that the police are the people that keep us safe. No, I'm sorry, but we keep us safe. As community members, we keep each other safe. And there's many instances of this where the police officers just increase harm and trauma onto our communities. And as a result, we become disenfranchised and traumatized as a community over and over again. And instead of being harmed and traumatized every single day, I think the point of the whole idea of defund the police is making sure that we invest in community health, community healing, and community care, right? Understanding that there's no one, that we got us and nobody else got us better than we do. And at the end of the day, I guess the slogan that kept being thrown around all over the summer is that we are all we have and we are all we need, right? That is eventually the goal. And investing in community-based organizations, in community, and organizations that are doing that hard work is probably the best thing ever. And instead of having police officers have military grade weapons and all of this stuff and like big new fancy cars, when our communities are struggling, that is what the defund the police is really all about. And I believe that at first it was just a policy initiative to get money to be a way to just try to get the city of Seattle to defund from the police. And now it's more about what can we do to make sure that community has what they need, that we understand that policing harms us, it traumatizes us. Obviously, policing is another thing that we're all socialized into being. Nobody can, like, when something very violent happens to us and something just very harmful happens to us, we automatically think of the police, and understanding that community is like being like alternatives to policing, all this stuff. That is what I believe the slogan is. And a lot of people have told me that, like, what if the police officers keep us safe? They keep us safe. They do this, they do that. And I'm like, no, they don't. And I hope people understand that now, and that people come to a conclusion that they don't keep us safe, that we keep us safe, and we keep each other strong.
Jermaine or Bera, any thoughts on what to make of defund the police as a slogan?
I would say that I found it to be a really good challenge and a good habit to ask your elders what they think of things when they sound automatically like a really great idea to you. And I did an informal survey in the past couple of weeks, and asked some elders from congregations where I've been a pastoral leader before, and even my current congregation, and asked people, what do you think about this slogan? And the responses ranged from eye rolls, just sounds just like dismissive, and others have had more to say and have said that it doesn't sound like a slogan of people who are serious about the communities about whom they're speaking. And that's been really helpful for me to actually listen to people who live in communities who are the most vulnerable for the absolute worst American policing has to offer. And also hear how at the same time their neighborhoods and the relationships inside their neighborhoods are also shaped by some of the worst effects that multiple layers and sources of anti-Blackness in American politics and economic life have shaped these communities. So that while people hate what the police are able to do with impunity in their neighborhoods, they also realize that they remain in a situation for the moment where they need to reach out, unfortunately, to the devil they know, to put it colloquially. And so it gives me pause to listen to what elders have to say who have been on the planet a little bit longer than I've been on this planet, and realize that there's a lot of work to be done to not only talk to, but to collaborate with and really commiserate with people who are subject to police violence. And they're also subject to all kinds of community violence that flow from so many different ways our communities have been neglected and underdeveloped and under siege in so many ways. And so it's sobering, but I think what I've learned is that, first of all, a slogan should work for you and not create liabilities for you. So it does matter maybe to consider the difference between saying something that represents like a feeling of anger and a feeling of impatience, and maybe work harder to form words that represent like the will of the people, and something that actually has the capacity of language to inspire people to want to join. And in addition to that, I think, speaking to other people who are closer to my peer group, I think those words, defund the police, also make people wonder, where do the people who shout defund the police the loudest live? And do they live in a neighborhood where, certain folks are also very impatient with the police, but don't want to send their kids out to play on a beautiful sunny day because they're unable to determine what they'll encounter? Or people who live in neighborhoods where they really want to be able to say, I need these few people who are doing X, Y, and Z on the corner to maybe do it somewhere else, so that the environment is different. So I think we have to deal with the fact that many of us shouting defund the police, not all of us, but many of us shouting defund the police would not notice the difference if the police were defunded tomorrow. But that people who do live in neighborhoods where they're subject to the worst American policing has to offer, they would notice the difference if the police were defunded tomorrow. And while they still would they would not love the police anymore, they would still not have solutions to other problems in their neighborhoods that come from different directions. And so I think it's important when we use language that we take into consideration this need to maybe dig sometimes a little bit deeper into the histories of our communities and see what language and what programs we can come up with that couple defunding the police with alternative systems of community care that we develop as we push to defund the police, and not, chronologically prior to or after.
Yeah, I want to thank you for what you just said. I mean, I think it's so really important that you talk about going to people who have had longer experience and more direct experience. And I think really I'm grateful that you brought that up. I have two thoughts on this that I just want to share. One of them is that I feel like defund the police, well, two things. It means two things. It means cut the police budget for some people, and for others, it means get rid of policing. And it doesn't make that clear in either case. So that's not the most felicitous terms. Defund the police, divest from police, invest in communities is perhaps a stronger way of saying that, to make it clear that we're not talking about just getting rid of, we're talking about reallocating. And although I think that from my perspective, at least, what I do like about defund is that it shows the aspirational goal of like eventually coming up to a world where we don't need police. It reminds me also, and I think this analogy can be helpful, when we look at our federal budget. We have a defense budget that isn't even subject to the same kind of proportional review that all the other elements of the budget are subject to. So that when there are reductions in the budgets that go across the board, the defense budget is immune to all of those. There is some kind of a mentality that sees this particular budget as sacrosanct and therefore, it can do what it wants. And it balloons incredibly, partly from perhaps fear and from senses of threats abroad or whatever. But a lot of it's fueled by business that has products that they want the defense industry to buy. And similarly, the police they are a market for products that people can sell. So I think that part of what this, and maybe we should be thinking about the language differently, but part of it is about this idea that the police budget is a infinitely inflatable number, which has seemed to govern most cities until we started talking about this, that there's no end. And if there's more money, then get more cool things like mechanic robot dogs or something. So I think that changing it, representing it as divesting, investing is one thing to talk about. And then maybe we do need to think about language that can keep the aspirational element around, that says, we may not be able to defund police tomorrow, and maybe that wouldn't even be a good idea. Maybe too many things would fall through the cracks that would be dangerous, and especially the most vulnerable would feel them. But at the same time, longer term, our goal would be to come up with some different conception of what community safety looks like. And do we need police to do that? And I'll just want to throw one more thing. When I think about the things that police do successfully, most of those are things that could be done by other people, without arms, without weapons. And so we really could start to think about, what does safety mean? And I don't just mean taking cats out of trees, but we don't necessarily, the model that we have is a dysfunctional model. And so when we say defund, I think we're saying get rid of this dysfunctional, destructive model rooted in a racist origin, but that has also never been able to free itself from that, and has also become corrupted in other ways in addition to that origin, that have made it impossible to rein in and repair as it is.
I wanted to add on to both points, and this is all I'm gonna say after this, but a big part of the defund the police movement is that, like what Bharat said about how like the language is weird, like defunding meaning like complete get rid or like whatever, but like investing, divest from SPD or police in general is like the biggest part of it too. So another thing that I wanted to add on to is that a lot of people all over the country have risked their lives to make defunding the police possible, right? And a lot of people understand just how traumatizing that experience can be, being on the streets every single day and realizing that you are only fighting for crumbs of the situation. And I have experiences myself, and one of the reasons why I can't go to an action or why I haven't been on the streets as much as I have, but have been been there, have been on the streets every single day during the summer, is because like we are fighting for something that has been taken away from us for so many years. and probably centuries, and how, like you said, Barat, like the federal budget, being that the military budget is like so much right now, and how this country invests so much in militarization and policing rather than in community, and like why the healthcare budget, or why, you know, why things are like taken away from, like why like our basic necessities, basic needs are not met, and why there are people out there who are unhoused, who are hungry, who can't pay their bills. Like there's stuff like that that's happened, and it's because this country and many cities all over the country have invested so much into policing, so much into militarization, that that causes this like community fear, this community trauma, this community, like instead of investing in community safety and in community care, right? And for a lot of us, we like, at least for me, in my opinion, because we risked our lives on the streets and every single day just like fighting for this policy to go and to make sure it happens, is because is the reason why so many of us with the Chauvin trial we're so frustrated, you know, and why we didn't see any change happening, because we were like, this is accountability, this isn't like justice, right? Like if it was justice, like because his daughter would have had a father now. That's the most frustrating part of all this. And why, like, because we risked our lives to make sure that doesn't never happens again, and we battle this idea of punishment versus restorative justice. It's all over the place, right? But that's the biggest part of it too, is that this past summer, in my opinion, being a Black Muslim woman was traumatizing as hell. But we are all working to make abolition a reality and make abolition the goal, you know? And I believe in my, and I'm just very idealistic, and maybe I'm just very hopeful, and like just in general, but like I'm not gonna call myself naive because that's not what I'm doing. I'm not doing that. But I believe that abolition can happen in our lifetimes. And I believe that police and prisons will be abolished in our lifetimes. But for it is only if we keep putting the pressure, and we keep going to keep being in the movement and continuously fighting for, you know, just for our lives and our safety and our community care and everything to be invested and to be accounted for in our communities. But yeah, I'm gonna just stop there.
That's a great segue to into my next question. Is
Can I just ask a
well,
question of Jermaine first? Just a
sure,
second.
go ahead.
Jermaine, just going back to what you said, could you just elaborate on what comments you got from people you spoke to about the policy and of defund and some of the concerns that were raised?
Sure. Yeah, just briefly. You know, some folks thought that the slogan is hyperbolic and not serious.
Mhm.
So that it's literally something to say, and you know, there's nothing behind it. No grassroots building, no serious thought to like building alternative systems of care that people can actually practice in a real world. And so it was interesting to have those conversations and point people in a different direction and say, well, consider these things.
Mhm.
Others thought simply that you don't have the numbers on your side. You have more people who actually are sad about having to see gruesome videos, and they just don't want to see the videos, and they want to see reforms or hear about reforms, and they're not actually interested in defunding the police because they rely on them to do what they're supposed to do.
Mhm.
And there are others who said things, well, we don't know if we can trust this younger generation to be thinking things all the way through.
Mhm.
And I'm an elderly person, and I live in a place where I can trust the police just a little bit more than I can the people
Mm.
who cause me to have to call the police.
Mm.
And you know, more things like that, and just people who don't know who the loudest defunders are. Like they don't see them in their neighborhood. They don't understand if they're also going to be available to help them learn as communities how to organize themselves in such a way that the loss of the police will only be the loss of the police. So a lot of opportunity there to actually, you know, hear from people and let them hear from those of us who do want to abolish the police. But a really important, I think, thing is to not underestimate the need to be clear with people about what you mean by slogans, and to show that you actually care more about communicating respectfully than simply shouting down all the potential naysayers. Which for me is an easy thing to overlook as something that's important, until I realized that in a democracy, there's a lot of persuasion that has to take place to make the things happen that we know are possible and that we know are necessary.
Thanks, Jermaine. I want to pivot to a really great question we got in the Q&A chat, which reads, as for the we all need, we are all we need part of abolition, I was wondering how religion plays into that. How can religion specifically help us come together as a community and take care of ourselves in a world without police and prisons? Any answers to that?
Yes, thank you. So a big thing about Islam and the Muslim community is that, and this is one thing that I have learned over the past few like several months, but in Islam, the Prophet, peace be upon him, once said that the Ummah, so the Muslim community, is like it's like it's like a body, you know? If one part of the body hurts, the entire body hurts, right? The community is like that. If one part of the community hurts, the entire community hurts. And that's what the Prophet, peace be upon him, once said. And another thing that is about Islam and the Muslim community in general is that we are encouraged, and maybe not encouraged, but we are required to treat each other like with respect, with dignity, to take care of each other, especially in times when we are struggling. And a big part of that is one of the 5 pillars of Islam is charity, right? Zakat in Arabic. And zakat means it can come into many forms. It could either mean donating money, it could even like smiling at a person is considered zakat, you know. That is a huge part of a huge part of my religion. But another big part of zakat is like bid'ah, which is basically like, you know, taking community care, right? And another part of it is like, you know, mutual aid. Mutual aid is considered zakat. Community care is considered zakat. Like all of this is considered zakat because of how we are supposed to be there for each other. We're supposed to take care of each other. In Ramadan, like those efforts of zakat and charity ramp up because we're in a month of fasting and spirituality and everything. But all throughout the year, it is a part of like our community and everything. And the reason I say mutual aid and abolition, all this in same sentence of Islam, is that abolition is very much an Islamic thing. It is a part of our religion, is a part of the 5 pillars of Islam. It is a part of who we are as Muslims, of who we are in general, right? And I think a big part of that too is making sure that Muslims all over the country understand this, especially where I live too, is that we have a very large Muslim population, and I have been the only Muslim in this fight for many years, for not many years, many months. But I also believe that the more of us in this fight, the better it will be. Because I also recently found out that police seem to not exist in any of the Muslim countries pre-colonialism, and it didn't exist in Somalia all the way up to like Palestine. Policing didn't exist anywhere near, you know. So, and I believe that if the police didn't exist in those Muslim countries pre-colonial, then why does it exist now? And why do we have a close relationship with police, specifically in our places of worship and in our communities as well, right? I believe that the concept of where we are all we need is a fundamental part of a fundamental part of Islam, and is a fundamental part of who we are as Muslims. We're supposed to take care of each other because we are all brothers and sisters in Islam. We're all brothers and sisters in Islam. We are there to take care of each other, be there for each other. If somebody is struggling, it is our Islamic duty, our Islamic right to take care of them, be there for them, all that stuff. But yeah.
Thank you, Nerda. Anybody else on this question?
I thought it was very interesting. I hadn't really thought about that particular point you made about the alliance with introductions of policing into countries post-colonialism, because it's interesting. I mean, Judaism also, I mean, in the traditional Jewish text, there is no police. I mean, it doesn't exist. There are shotrim. There are a few things where we have like get yourself judges, and there's a whole judicial system. But part of, I think, an explanation for that, I'm now just guessing, but thinking as a historian, as a biblical scholar, that in more homogenous communities, perhaps that was not needed as a method for maintaining safety among things. And to go back to the analogy with our military system, our defense budget, which is predicated on the idea that we as a country have to protect ourselves against them, other peoples, would suggest that there's something about this kind of militarized safety mechanism that is predicated on an us and a them. So one thing that we might think about is what our traditions teach us about us and them. And in fact, in my tradition, and I believe in all of our traditions, we are taught to not think in those terms. We're taught to think about us as each other's, siblings, as children of the same parental source. In Hebrew, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, every single person. So that when I look at you on this page, I'm looking at 4 images of God right in front of me, plus a photo of one. So that this idea that if we don't think of ourselves as communities that are different and therefore in conflict or need to be protected from each other, that may be something to it. So that just emerged to me from what you were saying, Nora, about the history of it connected to colonialism. But I think the other thing is essentially it's ideas. Basic to all religious traditions: respect, human dignity, and a sense of not just a personal autonomy, but a community responsibility. So I am not just me. If I am not for me, who will be for me? If I'm only for me, who am I? And if not now, when? This idea that we are, which is a quote from Hillel, one of the rabbis in a tractate of ethics, Pirkei Avot, the teachings of the ancestors, of the fathers. This idea that if we get rid of this notion, which is so endemic to American culture, of our autonomy, of our singularness, that we make ourselves and we behave without reference to other people, makes us in a kind of antagonistical position to people. And if we can draw more on this idea of being part of a community where we actually owe each other, looking out for each other. Think about any community, where it works, where like you have, a block where there's people who are in trouble one week, someone has a surgery and needs to have, have groceries brought up into the apartment or whatever. When it works, when we think about ourselves as part of a community and less as autonomous individuals, kind of just making it out for ourselves, that may be an element that our tradition teaches us. But there are other sources, and I'll come back to this in a minute. I don't want to talk too much longer, so I might come back with some, if we have time, some sources in Judaism that talk about alternatives. But let me just go ahead.
I really like the phrase that we are all that we need, and like I'm afraid that in at least Protestant American Christianity, this is not something that we believe. But despite that, we have resources within our tradition. I'm thinking specifically within this Easter season, the notion that those people who testified to like the reality of God and the risen Christ in the Pentecost gathered together and decided that they would put all the things together and that everything that they had, they would hold in common so that no one had too little and no one had too much. And at the same time, I think it has to be understood that, and I'm saying US American Protestants, because I think that set a lot of the political and social tone for the problems that we have with policing and prisons in our country. And for US American Protestants, to use the language of Cotton Mather, there's an understanding of being the new Israel and understanding indigenous people as a problem to be dealt with and the land as something to be conquered and maintained. And I think that belief in particular has a lot to do with the ways in which indigenous people in this land have been treated and Afro-Americans have been treated. And I think it also complicates our capacity to really say in good faith, we are all that we need, because the we, from the perspective of American Protestantism, has always been us versus them. And in the Reformed tradition, we say in a rough English translation, reformed and always being reformed. So it shows that despite what I just said, there is the capacity within our tradition to realize that there is always the necessity of of actively being reformed. And I think, again, one of the distinct problems that we have as we think about something like abolishing police and abolishing prisons is that, at least in my tradition, I don't want to say the majority, but there are a large number of people who actually believe that a sky father is going to descend from the clouds and come to the earth and like do magical things to solve the problems that we actually enjoyed causing while being on the earth. And I think within our religious traditions, we have to deal with those parts of our traditions that stubbornly, sentimentally, or perhaps even out of a lack of access to education, those parts where people cling to ideas that make us think that there is something other than this world and ourselves. So people who will not affirm we are all that we need are at least a part of my tradition in a very politically and socially powerful way. And so I think in order to make it true that we are all that we need, there have to be forms of communication and engagement with one another through which we actually take our traditions seriously enough to take out some of the garbage, so to speak, not human beings, but of course, ideas and doctrines, and really ask ourselves, can we be faithful, as Christians, to the meaning of the resurrection if we actually misunderstand symbols for some kind of literal rescue plan that actually puts a huge distance between ourselves and the people who are ground to dust by the structures that we create in the meantime.
There's
Thanks.
one more also thing from Judaism that I'd like to share, which is this notion throughout the book of Deuteronomy, when we talk about kind of the health of the community, there's this there's this emphasis on the health of the community that's embedded in Jewish biblical material and also in Jewish tradition. So that when the biblical authors say that when a transgression is carried out, a transgression of law, it impacts not only the perpetrator and the victim, but the health of the whole community. And so it's in order to restore the health of the community, the kahal, you need to have some kind of, part of the idea of punishment in biblical terms, and I'm not advocating this directly to our present day, but the point of it is to remove the guilt, the harm to the community as a whole. So rather than seeing this as it's about a person who transgressed who needs to be punished, it's about a problem that is erupted in the society that's evident in that act of injustice that needs to be dealt with and healed, so that we try to instead of punishing, we try to look at the root causes and try to create another, kind of a way of providing restitution. And again, in the biblical tradition, and I'm not going to advocate the Bible as a law code for today. There are many problems, but it again has this notion that restitution can happen it should happen in a way that is not destructive. So even though our biblical tradition has this language, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, etc., the rabbis very early on recognized that that could not have been meant to understood literally. Because, for example, if I have only one eye and I gouge out someone else's eye, and in retribution, someone gouges out my eye, then I'm now blind. And so my end fate is not the same. And so it cannot work. You cannot put those two things and automatically, assume that it can be done precisely. So they came up with this idea of monetary restitution. The idea is, how do you make whole? How do you provide some kind of vehicle to provide accountability and a sense of restoration and a sense of acknowledgement, and I guess a gift for the healing of the person who's been harmed, rather than thinking about it in terms of punishment and exile.
That's powerful. Thank you, Rabbi Barrett. I want to pivot a little bit to a more specific policy question, but I think what you just said relates to it a little bit. And so this is, do you see a role for an organization that is not the police, whose purpose is law enforcement? Related, if social workers instead of police show up to fraught situations where weapons are used, should they be armed? I see you nodding. Do you want to talk a little bit about your reasoning, Rabbi Barrett?
Let me let my colleagues talk first. I've talked a bit, so I'll just let them.
Can you repeat the question? I apologize.
Sure, yeah. So the question was, do you see a role for an organization which is not the police, whose purpose is law enforcement? Um, Related, if social workers, instead of the police, show up to fraught situations where weapons are used, should those social workers be armed?
Okay, I will. I think that's a recipe fraught for disaster. I mean, we've seen what vigilantes, I'm saying the word wrong, can do with weapons. You know, Zimmerman felt that it was his job to solve a problem in a community. He thought it was danger and he shot Trayvon Martin. So absolutely no in that respect. But I think it touches to the idea of, again, going back to root causes. Yes, okay, if they're arms, that's going to be a problem. And I cannot pretend to tell you the solution for that specific thing, but let's look at why there are arms in the community. Let's look at why there are weapons in the community in the first place. And what do we do about that to ensure that those situations are not are as you know, to say about abortion, legal and extremely rare or whatever, you know, so that there shouldn't. I think that adding arms, it's like when the NRA says that, you know, teachers should be armed to prevent school massacres.
I agree that, the answer is no. To take one, I mean, because you're drawing from the same people in the same culture. And so social workers showing up with guns to a situation where there are also weapons, to me, doesn't amount to a significant improvement upon the current situation with the police. But I also know if I show up with a gun to a situation where I feel threatened, I'm probably not going to be proud of the way that I behave, because like I'm not the most patient person with the best judgment when I have power and I'm angry. So I think there's a real need in our culture to begin a process by which we simply become better people. And that can't happen overnight. Although, as Nura has said, it needs to happen right now. It needs to happen in our lifetime. I think that's where faith communities come in, because it's not just about taking guns out of the police's hands and putting them in the hands of social workers, as if these are like vastly different human beings on the planet. Which is not to say anything against social workers, but I mean, this is a violent culture. US America is a very violent place with nuclear weapons at the heads of other countries so that we can exercise leadership. So the violence is not those people. Like, we're a violent culture. We use overwhelming force as a way to avoid having overwhelming force used against us. And that has a lot to do with our failure so far to simply become better people when it's possible for us to become better people. And I think this becoming of better people has a lot to do with where faith communities have failed and where faith communities have a continued role, even as we abolish prisons and the police as absolutely soon as possible.
I also want to add on to that is that social workers in this situation, more often than not, do practice policing as well. And goes into the whole, they practice within the whole police system. Like, for example, this is just an example, how when something goes down in a family's home, a social worker would come and take the children from the parents. And that also kind of like goes to onto Jermaine and Barat's point around like it's a system for disaster, right? Asking teachers to have guns is like asking social workers to practice violence and harm and trauma. Same thing happens with policing. So they all participate within the same system of contributing to harm onto communities, and they can and having a gun and you know instituting that will just continue um, contributing to the harm of contributing to harm in those communities even more. I believe that in order, like what Jermaine said, being able to practice being better people is one of them, and the other part is also the whole violence. Like, we are a very violent culture as well, but being able to understand that there are methods to de-escalate a situation like that, and practicing. And I'm a huge advocate for transformative justice in general, because I've seen it play out in my community, and a lot of great things can happen when we practice transformative justice and trying to get out of the root of the problem, and understanding that people can come from a variety of places and situations, and coming together to talk about why we did that situation, why we did this, or why we thought like that, why we believed that, why, what constituted us to being who we are and being able to inflict harm onto another human being. All of that is a part of transformative justice. And when things like that is so escalated as well, being able to de-escalate it is something that a lot of teachers, social workers, police officers, anybody who participates in the system of policing needs to be able to learn how to do. But
Yeah.
and
Also, I think to what Jareen was saying about learning to be better people. I mean,
I was gonna say
when we look at policing, I mean, in absolute numbers, yes, police kill a lot of people, not just Black people, but proportionately, we know that police kill Black people more quickly, and that, you know, it's hard to not attribute that to some aspect of a mental attitude towards some people, that the police who are doing this are in a way are acclimated or trained or have been raised to feel this way, or whatever reasons, to see Black bodies in front of them as something different. And that's what makes, you know, the shooting happen more quickly. We know, I mean, the most egregious just example of the disparity is Dylan, whatever his name is, I forget now, getting taken out to get a cheeseburger or whatever on his way out after killing people in the church in North Carolina, versus how people who were even unarmed are being shot by police. So that's about, again, the humanity, regaining that sense of that people we are encountering are other humans. Michelle Alexander says, you know, we have to think when we look at any situation where we see someone who has perhaps caused harm, to think to ourselves, like, if that were my child, how would I want that to be dealt with? You know, what would I want to have happen if that was my child who is in this situation, whether it's the child who's caused harm or the child who is in danger, you know, whether it's a child who is has been in a fight and perhaps needs to be stopped from that fight, or a person who is being chased by police, or a person who's been put into prison or jail. What would I want if that were my child? And if we can start to really, again, think about people as fellow, I mean, it's so simple, and it reduces to such a fundamental thing, and yet it is the crucial thing. Mm-hmm. If we can know that other person is me and I am that person, and the same thing, literally, what I do not want done to me, I should not do to that person.
Right. Yeah. Okay, we have 3 minutes left, so I want to do a bit of a lightning round. So in under a minute, the last question I want to ask is, what do you think is the unique role that people of faith or religious communities play in abolitionist movements? And if you have time, another question we got was if you have any book recommendations, so feel free to sprinkle that in too. So who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll just, because my phone's up. I think it's that to bring the moral weight when the conversation is when the bring the moral weight into the conversation. Our country is actually takes religion very seriously, even if we don't necessarily follow it. So faith leaders have a kavod, have a weightiness, that we can bring to it, and that we should use that. We should use that as much as we can. Books to read. There's a book I just read recently by Kaya Stern called Voices from Prisons, Faith, Healing, and Education, which I really recommend. And that's the only one I can think of right now.
I'd say being able to contribute to the larger discussion of religion and my allergies are acting up, so I apologize if I'm like a little like over it. But anyway, being able to talk about the concept of morality and justification for all of the stuff that's been going on, and understanding that, like what Bharat said, bringing that moral weight to the issue, being like, this is a humanity, dignity, and issue, right? Because at the end of the day, and I'm sure this is true across the board, all humans are born free, right? So that is something that I believe all religions believe, that we're all born free and we should all be treated as such. And books, yes, I'd say if you want to talk about prisons, by I forgot this guy's name. I really forgot his name. And another book is if you're an organizer and like you want to learn more about prisons and how to institute them and book all that stuff, is Angela Davis's book. I forgot the name of that too, but
Are prisons obsolete, right?
yes. And then the other one is Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy as well. But I think that's it.
I would simply echo what my other co-panelists said, and perhaps add one more thing, which is that I really think we have to help our congregation members understand how absolutely short US American history has been, and to apply our theological and spiritual understandings of the future to the things that we have done in the past, and an assessment of what damage it's caused and what we need to do now to have a better future. But sometimes we theologize our politics and vice versa. But I think to also include in spiritual development, catechism, confirmation, like help us figure out, or we can help one another figure out that the future is a matter of what types of people we become and the types of formation that we undergo, and that it's not esoteric to talk about history, to talk about politics, but it's actually a way of spiritually discerning what our responsibility is to all of our inheritances and the fact that we all have the right to live. And like others said, to not be afraid to be both morally heavy, but also instructive, and to use the best means to persuade each other. If it takes a long time, then go for the long haul. If it can be done quickly, then do it quickly, but focus on getting it done and transforming people so that we actually create the types of relations that can transform. And I'll put a couple of books in the chat just because I looked ahead and I knew people had questions. I think everybody's heard of The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, and Golden Gulag by Ruth Gilmore. There are some others that are a little bit more wonky and granular, but why not? Because reading is reading. So The Prison and the Gallows, The Politics of Mass Incarceration in America is really good by Marie Gottschalk. City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, and The Prison and the Factory, Origins of the Penitentiary System.
Awesome. Jermaine, Bara, Nerda, thank you so much for your time and wisdom today. We are very appreciative. Reminder for those watching, please consider joining DSA and also check out the rest of the panels that will be this afternoon. And thanks a lot. Have a good one.